In her book, The Serviceberry, Abundance and Reciprocity in the Natural World, Indigenous author Robin Wall Kimmerer retells a story shared by linguistic anthropologist Daniel Everett of learning from a hunter-gatherer community in Brazil. While he was there, a hunter brought home a large kill, and Everett asked him what the process was to smoke and dry that meat for storage. And while the hunter knew about those processes, he was confused by Everett's question, and he responded by asking Everett in return, "Why would I store the meat?" Instead, the hunter sent out invitations to his community to gather and feast. His neighbors and their families gathered at his home to celebrate and eat with one another. Nothing went to waste, and nothing was stored. This was different than what the anthropologist would have predicted based on his home country's economic practices, and he labeled that difference maladaptive. In the capitalist framework of his home culture, behavior other than solely individual self-interest behavior is simply not rational. Now Everett was confused, so he asked the hunter again why he would choose not to store the meat for his future. And the hunter replied, "Store my meat? I store my meat in my brother's belly." The logic of unregulated capitalism depends on and demands that individuals act in solely self-interested ways, operating on extraction to create excess profits for owners. This so-called excess is extracted from labor, it's extracted from the earth, from trade, from consumers, from communities, and it is stored in the wallets and stocks and banks of owners. The system has normalized the extraction of profit and the accumulation of profit as simply rational, despite its exclusion of millions of people, as well as things like housework and child rearing and caretaking, not to mention its exclusion of factors like clean water and air and a livable planet. The thing is, though, there are other systems of economy with other goals. There are other values that might guide how we as humans relate to one another and to the earth and to labor and to our own worth. Goals and values and priorities other than profit alone require regulation or entirely different systems. Here in the United States, we've mixed democracy with capitalism, which has meant for us adding some regulations through democratic decisions to include goals other than profit in the rules about how our society runs. What we're witnessing right now is a massive swing towards removing those shared democratic goals that we decided on together and moving towards more and more exclusion. We're witnessing the dismantling of democratic efforts at inclusion, from DEI efforts to Black History Month to economic inclusion via the social safety net. People working in social services this week have had a wretched week of wondering if their jobs will continue, and worse, wondering if millions of people are going to lose access to resources that they depend on for food and housing and healthcare. This last couple of weeks has been an attempt to dismantle the mediating force of democracy. The work over the last 100 years, 200 years of Black people, of women, of queer folks, of indigenous folks, of people of color, of people with disabilities, to put values other than the accumulation of profit into place, to make our system have other goals than simply the accumulation of profit. Our work, the work of the people, has been to regulate the distribution of power and resources according to those other values. Other values, values like love and justice, values like inclusion and liberation, our values, our Unitarian Universalist values that say human worth and dignity matters. Fair access to education and housing and hope matters. Our values of love and justice being at the center of what we do, those are the things that have been dismantled or attempted at being dismantled, because the story isn't over yet, friends. The values of inclusion and liberation are just fundamentally different than values of domination and power and hierarchy, than self-interest and the accumulation of excess profit. We, as a people who are Unitarian Universalists and part of a democracy and have been laboring for years and decades and generations, we know that we are interdependent. We know that the truth of reality of the world is that we are bound up with one another, that we are entangled, as the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King said, in an inextricable network of mutuality. We know that that is just the way the world works. We cannot be separated from one another, and any attempt at separation is, in fact, illogical, irrational, and only benefits a very few people. We know that we must store our food in the bellies of our siblings because we know that all thriving is mutual, that we rise and fall together because it's the nature of reality. In the serviceberry, Robin Wall Kimmerer writes that all thriving is mutual. She writes about other ways of understanding how to organize ourselves as human community. She looks to nature first for examples. She looks to our relatives, the plants, and she holds up the gift economy of the earth, the natural way of being. In the story, she gathers buckets full of wild serviceberries, unearned, freely given to her, to the birds, to the bears. She bears witness to the generosity of the earth, to the gift economy that offers grace to all living beings. She bears witness to the plenitude and the abundance of freely given gifts like the air that we breathe, and the water that we drink, and food that grows on trees. The rain never falls from the sky and says, "You owe me." The sun never shines on our skin and says, "That'll be $5, please." Wall Kimmerer points to cultures of sharing. Particularly in indigenous communities, I store my food in the belly of my sibling. She tells the story of Western Pacific indigenous communities' practices of potlatches. Potlatches, which were high ceremonial celebrations where wealthy community members would host a celebration, a potlatch, to give away free gifts and wealth to the community members. In these communities, in this practice, power was displayed not by how much one could accumulate, but by how much one could give away. The practice kept the resources circulating in the community as an intentional ceremony, but also celebration and joy in sharing. Now, interestingly, in the late 1800s, the Canadian government outlawed potlatches because they were, quote, unproductive and contrary to the civilized values of accumulation. Outlawed. Maybe self-interested accumulation isn't natural. If you have to outlaw it, maybe accumulation is a cultural value that has to be enforced. Gift economies, sharing economies, economies of mutual aid and voluntary offering, economies of care, are all visible counterpoints to capitalism. And they exist today. Giving out of love, sharing as an expression of the value of human community are alternative value structures. They are resistance. These alternative economies are everywhere if you just look for them. In our society, they will tell you that they're illogical or irrational or just won't work, and yet they are working right now, today. These material expressions of the value of care and community rather than accumulation and power exist among us. They are within the borders of this capitalist system, sometimes as an intentional practice of resistance to the current system, like mutual aid and buy nothing networks, and sometimes as necessary caring work that has to be done but also supports the current system, like women's labor in the home. What we do here at church is a gift economy. Everything we do here in this community is shared and voluntary. It is freely given. The resources that keep the lights on and buy the coffee and pay for the printing and for the staff support that keep it running, but also the labor of the ushers and the greeters and the house band, of the finance team and the pledge team and the board, all of that's voluntary offerings, freely given by all of you to create this community that you freely offer to anyone who wants it. This $1 million a year budget that we are all participating is a gift economy. And it's functioning right now. We have a photocopy machine. We have well-tuned musical instruments. We have a band and a sound system and lighting. And all of it was created by you participating in an alternative economy, freely and voluntarily, and then offering that gift economy to anyone who wants to come in and receive it. But even more than that, you also are taking it out into the world. The vision, the beacon of Unitarian Universalist values that says we believe in the inherent worth and dignity of every human being, and we are putting it into practice in the way that we live, you are also taking out into the world, in your justice work, in the beacon of Unitarian Universalist values. This place, it is, yes, a shelter, a values shelter from the pain of greed and cruelty. But we also have the audacity to put our love-centered values out into the storm of the world and proclaim liberating love for all people. That is what we are practicing. The spiritual practice of generosity, of giving, is a practice of our belief that all thriving is mutual, and that we are fundamentally, inextricably interdependent with one another. This is a different way to live. This is a different way to be. This is a different functioning economy than principles of exclusion and power and domination. We're out here saying freedom and kinship are the values that we practice rather than ownership, and we are proclaiming those values through our practice, through what we actually do. That's how we're proclaiming our faith, that we belong to one another. The logic of extraction, of the self-interested individual, is nonsense. It is harmful nonsense, but it is nonsense nonetheless, and it is not the only way to do things. Capitalism's, 500-ish years old? Human community is 200,000 years old. We have done this in different ways all over the world and right now for a very long time. And the good news, dear ones, is that we already know how to do this. We are doing it right now. We have made community based on voluntary sharing and the principle that all thriving is mutual right here because we exist. And we can keep making more community this way. We exist here now, today. The beloveds within and among us, all of us, we exist today. Trans people exist. Saying that they don't is nonsense. Black people exist. Trying to erase Black History Month is nonsense. Trying to tell us not to tell our stories or our history is nonsense. Queer people exist, women exist, people with disabilities exist, and we are all entangled with one another. There is no separating us out. Even if you say we're not going to tell your story on this national website, the existence is undeniable. We are here, we are now living with one another. None of us are fictions. None of us will be erased, and we already know how to live together in community with one another, each and every one of us, beloved. We already know how to lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring. Dear ones, the best place to store our food is in the bellies of our siblings and kin. And we know that our siblings and kin are the whole of humanity. We practice sharing, we practice interdependence in community because food security actually happens either way, whether you dry and store your meat in a locker or whether you store it in the belly of your siblings and kin, food security happens. But depending on which choice you make, relationships are very different. Community is very different. Life is very different. If you spend your afternoon smoking and drying the meat, or if you spend your afternoon with your beloveds in feast, those are different ways to live. And so we make choices to practice our values and invest in our community and invest in our dreams of the beloved community of the future. So yes, it's a pledge drive. We're raising money. That's true. That's what's real. But we're also practicing our values. It's a spiritual practice of saying, I actually believe in our interdependence, and I will offer what I can to my community so that we can thrive mutually, together. We're not engaging here in a fee-for-service structure. We're practicing voluntary economy with love at the center. This is a spiritual practice, both for the soul, but also for an economy where community and love are centered as a point of resistance to greed and accumulation, exclusion, and power. In these painful days of deliberately sown chaos and powerful cruelty, we have to keep dreaming. We have to keep our eyes on the prize, on that beloved community that Dr. King told us was possible. There is a practice called freedom dreaming. It was developed by Professor Robin Kelly, and that practice, freedom dreaming, it calls us to envision that beloved community, to envision the thing that we fight together for, rather than spending our energy and time picturing or lamenting or freaking out about what we're fighting against. Freedom dreaming calls us to keep dreaming and keep articulating the dream and investing in the dream of the world we want to live in. When I do freedom dreaming, I dream of a world where all of our practices of economy are voluntary, where our offerings to the world are voluntary, where we're not required or owned by any corporation, but only we belong to each other. My practice of freedom dreaming has mutual thriving where everyone is fed. Everyone is housed, everyone is clothed, and everyone has access to hope and joy and celebration. Everyone knows that they are beloved and included and part of the community. No one is excluded for any reason, race or sexuality or gender or age, ethnicity, immigration status. Everyone is part of this community because all humans have inherent worth and dignity. In my freedom dreaming, we have what we need and we spend our time creating joy and happiness and strength and art and song and beauty. Dear ones, there is enough. There is enough in this world. We have what we need. The only problem is when the resources are distributed in skewed ways. We have what we need and we know how to do it. Let us practice our values, both here in this shelter from greed and cruelty, but also out there in the streets, being a beacon of keeping love at the center of how we live, generosity as how we work with one another, and hope for the future as the dream that we keep striving for. The seeds of that dream are alive right here, right now, today. The seeds are in the earth. Beneath this cold snow, the seeds of the future are living in communities like ours right now, communities of resistance and gift giving and sharing. And together those seeds, with our careful attention and strength and love, they will grow. Spring will come. We do not need to be afraid. We just keep watering this dream. We're dreaming together, and together we make it real. May it be so.